In just one day, President Trump went from threatening to end Iranian civilization to touting a 2-week ceasefire. But tonight, what's really changed?
Hours after President Trump openly threatened a whole civilization could die in Iran, news of a 2-week ceasefire temporarily calmed markets, lowered oil prices, and eased fears of a catastrophic escalation in the now 6-week-long war.
Sirens and smoke marked yet another day of missiles flying throughout the region, and Iranian state media is saying tonight that the Strait of Hormuz is closed.
But questions quickly arose about the durability of the pause and whether it offers a real path to negotiations or just a brief reset in a continued military conflict.
President Trump forged this moment. Iran begged for this ceasefire, and we all know it. As the President truthed this morning, a big day for world peace. Iran wants it to happen. They've had enough. Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory on the battlefield. A capital V military victory.
The Pentagon on Wednesday declared an historic and overwhelming military victory over Iran, whose missile program, it said, was functionally destroyed.
What little they have left buried in bunkers is all they will have. They can still shoot, we know that. Their command and control is so decimated they can't really talk and coordinate, so they still may shoot here and there, but that would be very, very unwise. But they can no longer build missiles, build rockets, build launchers, or build UAVs. Their factories have been razed to the ground, set back in historic fashion. You see, had Iran refused our terms, the next targets would have been their power plants, their bridges, and oil and energy infrastructure. Targets they could not defend and could not realistically rebuild. It would have taken them decades, and we were locked and loaded.
But the day after the ceasefire was announced proved to be deadly and destructive, with massive Israeli strikes in Lebanon, multiple Iranian attacks on Gulf countries, and the Strait of Hormuz still largely shut down. The threats by President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to target civilian infrastructure in Iran and overlook constraints of international and humanitarian law triggered global alarm that the U.S. could be crossing a dangerous legal and moral line.
Hundreds of protesters rallied outside the White House yesterday demanding President Trump's removal after he threatened to destroy Iran's whole civilization. This follows his threat to target power plants and bridges in Iran. Critics say if he had gone ahead with such an attack, it would have constituted a war crime. But the White House is waving off those concerns. In a statement, the deputy press secretary said, quote, "The Iranian people welcome the sound of bombs because it means their oppressors are losing." Ona Hathaway is a professor of law at Yale Law School and the president-elect of the American Society of International Law and joins us from New Haven to discuss this. Ona, good morning. Who exactly gets to decide what constitutes a war crime? Because the past 24, 48 hours, we've heard this debated.
Yeah, well, so a war crime is a serious violation of international humanitarian law. And making threats like to wipe out an entire civilization is making a threat clearly to commit war crimes, as is threats to destroy civilian infrastructure, water treatment plants, electrical plants, and bridges with no clear purpose, no clear military purpose. So those would all be war crimes if, in fact, they had been carried out.
Now, what do you make of the White House's justification that Iranians would welcome the sound of falling bombs and the fact that the president made this threat less than 24 hours ago from when we are speaking, and it seems to have done it as a negotiating tool? Is that justified?
It's absolutely not justified, no. And let's put aside whether, in fact, he's right about that. I question the truth of whether, in fact, Iranians welcome this. But even if they did, and even if this was an effective negotiating tactic, it's absolutely not lawful. You can't make threats of use of force in order to get a better deal. That is clearly illegal under the United Nations Charter. It's clearly illegal under the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. And it's clearly illegal under the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties. So this is absolutely not justified. And even if the president thinks that this is helping him make a better deal, which I do question because it really raises questions about whether the White House is actually behaving rationally. But even if that was true, it would still be very much a violation of international law.
And we all know that because of the expression, the fog of war, sometimes there can be strikes and killings that were seemingly not intentional, accidental. So what might the consequence be for the U.S. president if such actions were carried out?
Yeah, so, what's troubling about these threats and about much of what we've been hearing from the White House and from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth are threats that make clear they don't actually care about the law and they don't care about the obligations to protect civilians, which is the core obligation of the law. Really what the law is trying to do is protect people during war. It's trying to protect innocent civilians who have done nothing wrong, who are not legitimate military targets. It's trying to protect them from violence. And much of what we've been hearing out of the White House and out of the Secretary of Defense are threats to ignore that law, which has, again, that purpose of protecting human beings during wartime. And what it's very troubling, part of the reason that's so troubling is that when we see things like the strike on the girls' school that killed over 150 people, we have to wonder, are they really being careful? Are they taking their legally required precautions to make sure that they're verifying the targets, that they're making sure the targets are actually military objectives? They're checking the maps to make sure that they've been updated. They look at pattern of light to make sure that there aren't people using these buildings in ways that they're not expecting. And given that they seem to completely disregard the law and its protective principles, it raises real questions as to whether these are real mistakes and whether the U.S. military is doing all it should be doing to making sure that it's protecting the civilians who are innocent in the midst of all this.
Well, I appreciate you giving us some insight into all of this, and the threat alone can have its own consequence for the U.S. Politically.
The White House, for its part, defended what it called the president's very tough language as leverage. Here's Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
The president yesterday threatened that a whole civilization would die if a ceasefire deal wasn't reached, understanding that Iranian leaders have previously said death to America. But why is it appropriate for the president of the United States to use that kind of language when talking about civilian targets? And was the president mocking Islam by signing off his Truth Social post over the weekend, praise be to Allah? Wouldn't that antagonize Muslim allies across the world?
Well, I understand the questions about the president's rhetoric, but what the president cares most about is results. And in fact, his very tough rhetoric and his tough negotiating style is what has led to the result that you are all witnessing today. Iran publicly acknowledging last night that they have agreed or that they wanted this ceasefire with the United States because they no longer could tolerate being bombed by our very powerful and lethal military, and that they have committed to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which the president will hold them accountable for, and it's something the administration is closely monitoring in real time.
So,
Danny.
Should the world not take his word seriously?
The world should take his word very seriously in understanding that the president is always most interested in results. And it was the Iranians who backed down, not President Trump. He said that they would face very grave consequences, as you just laid out, by the 8 p.m. deadline if they did not agree to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And what did they do last night? They agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
How much leverage the U.S. retains over the Iranian regime also remains a question. Its leadership, still intact, is apparently digging in on long-standing points of contention, including the right to nuclear enrichment.
Let's bring in CBS News contributor and retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He also served as a national security advisor in the first Trump administration. Lots to break down here. So Joint Chief of Staff's Dan Kane had said that there were 3 objectives over the last month: destroy Iran's ballistic missile and drone capabilities, destroy the Iranian Navy, and destroy their defense industrial base. And he says all 3 of those things were accomplished. Let's listen.
Over the course of 38 days of major combat operation, the joint force achieved the military objectives as defined by the president. We welcome the ongoing ceasefire, and as the secretary said, we hope that Iran chooses a lasting peace.
So was this Tuesday deadline a real threat, or in your view, sort of a tactic in the negotiations?
Well, Chanel, I think that, we did destroy those capabilities, but they still have some remaining, some missiles, some drones. And I think what remains to be seen is will the Iranians try to reconstitute those capabilities? I think unless there is a fundamental change in the nature of the regime, a regime that is now dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, an organization and people who are hostile to the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, or the cancerous boil is how they refer to Israel, and their Arab neighbors, there won't be enduring peace. So I see this as kind of a, maybe a temporary ceasefire, and maybe along with it, a hope for a change in the nature of the regime in Iran, because they've been under so much duress. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. So I think this is really kind of a temporary arrangement.
I want to get your take, General, on the New York Times reporting that the president made this decision, according to the New York Times, that the president decided to make this decision after having a briefing and a meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, along with his senior advisors in the room, including Susie Wiles, including the Vice President of the United States, the Defense Secretary, and others, and that there were some in the administration who cautioned against doing something like this. The New York Times reports that the vice president said that this would be going against some of the promises that the president made to the American people, that this would cause regional instability. Those things seem to have come to fruition. I wanted to just get your take on that reporting. You've been in that room. You know what it's like when the president of the United States is weighing decisions that will monumentally affect Americans and, frankly, the entire world.
Right. Hey, Vlad, I think that kind of discussion has to happen. It's good that it happened. You want to have people viewing different or airing different perspectives and considering the long-term costs and consequences. And I think in this case, it was important to consider the costs and consequences of action, as well as the costs and consequences of inaction. And I think what we saw with this massive onslaught by the Iranians on 14 countries in the region, that them having that kind of capability, that drone missile strike complex, was unacceptable, not just for regional security, but U.S. interests in the region. And Vlad, what they were doing was developing this kind of shield, this conventional shield of missiles and drones, so that behind it, they could develop the most destructive weapons on Earth. And an intercontinental ballistic missile. I know there have been some people say, well, we don't really know, if they're doing that. Well, hey, they had a space program. But that's not really a space program. I mean, that's a program to develop missiles that can range the United States. So I think in retrospect, the cost of inaction, even though the cost of action was high, it would have been far higher than the cost of action here.
But President Trump, he didn't get the regime change that he was calling for. Iran still has control over the Strait of Hormuz right now. So what might these negotiations really look like moving forward? Obviously, there are sticking points on both sides here. I mean, could the U.S. end up really at square one when this is over?
Yeah, I think so, Chanel. I mean, I think that unless, again, there's a change in the ideology and the aspirations that drive and constrain the Iranian regime, then there's not going to be peace, because this is a regime that has continued to repress its own people and has fomented sectarian civil wars across the Middle East and surrounded Israel with a ring of fire, lit that ring of fire on October 7th, 2023, attacked Israel directly twice in 2024, and it now has burst kind of the economic model for the Gulf, and has placed that all at risk for the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis and the Saudis, and has held the global economy hostage. So unless there's a change in the aspirations that drive that regime, which is to kick the U.S. out of the region, establish hegemonic influence, surround Israel, and kill all the Jews, that's really what they want to do, then there's not going to be peace that comes from this kind of an agreement. There has to be really a change in the nature of that government somehow.
Continued Israeli military action in Lebanon against the Iranian-backed Hezbollah militant group also emerged as a key sticking point. After initial comments by Pakistan indicated Lebanon was included in the truce, Vice President J.D. Vance said that stemmed from a legitimate misunderstanding.
There seems to be a disagreement about whether Lebanon was included in this proposal, and the Speaker of the Parliament, who you're going to sit across from the table from in Islamabad, has just said that he thinks negotiations would be unreasonable while that war is ongoing. So would you ask Israel to hold off strikes to allow some space for these talks?
Well, first of all, I know there's been some conversations between the Israelis and the leadership of our country today. I haven't been involved in that because I've been busy doing stuff in Hungary. I'm actually supposed to get an update when I get on the plane. But let me say a couple things. First of all, I actually think, and there's a lot of bad faith negotiation and a lot of bad faith, propaganda going on. I think this comes from a legitimate misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't.
Iran furiously disagreed. The foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, posted that if America didn't rein Israel in, the ceasefire was off.
We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states. Now, that said, the Israelis, as I understand it, again, I'm supposed to get a fuller report when I get on the plane, have actually offered to be, frankly, to check themselves a little bit in Lebanon because they want to make sure that our negotiation is successful. That's not because that is part of the ceasefire. I think that's the Israelis trying to set us up for success, and we'll, of course, see how that unfolds in the next few days. But look, if Iran wants to let this negotiation fall apart in a conflict where they were getting hammered over Lebanon, which has nothing to do with them and which the United States never once said was part of the ceasefire, that's ultimately their choice. We think that would be dumb, but that's their choice.
Vice President Vance and envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are expected in Islamabad, Pakistan for peace talks on Saturday, even as disputes over ceasefire violations and preliminary points of agreement continue to multiply. I'm Olivia Gazis for CBS News in Washington.